This podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, you're cleaning. If you're like me, you're exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. So multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. This episode is brought to you by Schwab. Do you ever think about your money? Sure you do. You probably think about it all the time. But guess what? Your money's been thinking about you too. And it wants you to know that a financial plan can lead to 2.7 times higher net worth on average. That's why Schwab makes starting one easier than ever, with one-on-one guidance from a financial consultant and a complimentary online retirement plan that you can start in as little as 15 minutes. Plus, track your progress with free digital planning tools. So what are you waiting for? Visit schwab.com/plan today to learn more. When I think about China's zero COVID policy, the rules that kept millions of people in lockdown, sometimes for months at a time, I think about emptied out streets in Shanghai. I think of the PCR tests government officials required of every resident week after week. But Dake Kang from the Associated Press, he thinks about something else.
I mean, just to give you an idea of how crazy things were getting before zero COVID ended, I had quite a few friends and acquaintances who were having farewell parties and going to Thailand because they were just like, this is too much, I'm out.
For Dake, zero COVID was surprisingly effective until it wasn't. And then it became this opportunity for everyday people in China to rebel, coming up with workarounds to avoid the apps that the government used to track them.
You know, at a certain point, by the end, I think people were just straight up resorting to using fake health codes or recording the sound of, the health code scan so that they could get into places without actually having to scan the codes, because so many people were fed up with this policy.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about that, but that's like an ingenious thing. Just record the little like bling bling and like play that. And then
that's exactly what happened. I mean, it was an open dissent, but, it was basically people being like, I'm done with this.
Then these individual dissents became communal. People started protesting in the streets, which is when the Chinese government decided to reverse course. Dake says the cause and effect was not as neat as all that. By the time protesters started openly speaking out, the government had been looking to ease away from zero COVID for a while.
So it was this really confusing period for like a month when people weren't really sure what exactly the central government wanted. Was it zero COVID or was it not zero COVID? Was it something else?
It turns out that what happened next wasn't very neat either. You chronicled the way zero COVID led to all kinds of discontent. Now that restrictions have been lifted, is that discontent lifting too?
I think that's a complicated question because quite a few people are happy, quite a few people are unhappy. I think everyone, however, is a bit puzzled at just how quickly the government moved to lift restrictions, because it's pretty clear that the government could have done more to prepare for the exit from zero COVID.
The virus is overwhelming hospitals across the country. The sick struggle to get help.
The cases have just gone out of control, and
it's like the opposite of zero.
This video CNN has obtained was filmed by a man who said his father's body was lying in this overflowing Beijing hospital morgue for days. He said his father waited hours for hospital bed space. By the time a bed opened up, it was too late.
It is the opposite of zero. I mean, you have probably hundreds of millions of cases at this point, even if you don't necessarily have the statistics to reflect that.
Today on the show, why China went from COVID zero to COVID everywhere. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. Support for this podcast comes from Wise, the universal account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. With one account for over 50 currencies, who exactly is Wise made for? It's made for jet setters and slow travelers, for seeing old friends in new places. Wise is made for business in the city and pleasure on the coast, for studying abroad and supporting your little brother's schooling back home. Wise is made for people without borders, who want to live truly global lives with ease. You see, with Wise, you always get the mid-market exchange rate whenever you convert or spend different currencies. There are no markups and no hidden fees. That's pounds to pesos, dollars to dong, just like that. Helping you save on currency conversion wherever your money takes you. Wise. It's the account that's made for the world. Join 13 million customers and learn how the Wise account could work for you at wise.com/whatnext. This episode is brought to you by Charles Schwab. Schwab's passion for serving clients is more than just standard practice. It's part of who they are. With transparent pricing, 24/7 live support, and a satisfaction guarantee, the people at Schwab go the extra mile to help you on your investing journey. They are not just financial people. They're people too. Learn more at schwab.com/whyschwab. The Chinese Communist Party officially dropped its zero COVID restrictions on December 7th. Party machinations can be mysterious from the outside, but Dake Kang says, as far as we can tell, there were a couple of factors that swayed the party leader, Xi Jinping, to change course. First, there were those protests that broke out all around the country in November. They fueled unrest, they undermined party control. But just as important, maybe more so, was COVID's impact on China's bottom line. Data released this week shows that in 2022, China's economy had its worst performance in decades.
I mean, this was basically a pressure cooker situation because there was pressure coming from all sides, right? Local governments were also being told that they had to spend huge sums of money setting up a massive PCR testing infrastructure and to test basically everyone in the province every few days. That's extremely expensive. So local governments were also running out of money. And you'd hear rumors of, government officials flying to Beijing to try and get loans from banks because they had a big hole in their budget. The Wall Street Journal reported that the head of Foxconn, one of Apple's biggest suppliers, had sent a letter to the Chinese leadership begging them to, reconsider zero COVID because it was crippling their production and having a big effect on their factories. So you can see that it was really damaging the economy. And, just from my personal perspective, I mean, there's a street down from where I live, which is famous for its restaurants. And by the time zero COVID were lifted, half or more of those restaurants had shut down and gone out of business. I mean, you could feel it on a visceral level. You would go traveling in China, you would go to these famous tourist spots, places that used to be thronged with tourists, so packed that you could barely move, before the pandemic. And I would wander around there and it would be empty. It was just surreal. So it was really, really hurting the economy. And that was definitely a factor.
Still, up to the last minute, the party waffled. The South China Morning Post reported that the original plan was not to reopen the country till March.
That is what would make sense, right? During the winter, COVID is more likely to spread quickly because people tend to stay indoors. The air is drier. Also, there's the flu. So you don't want the flu circulating at the same time as you have COVID. But it seems like the government's hand was forced to a certain degree. I mean, the change was so sudden. And, before December 7th, the government was still saying in newspaper editorials that they wanted to absolutely uphold zero COVID.
So what happened on December 7th? How did the government do this U-turn?
Yeah, so the government basically said on December 7th, they published a list of 10 measures to adjust their COVID measures. They never actually formally declared the end of zero COVID, which is interesting, not surprising. I mean, it's kind of awkward to be saying in all your state newspapers, resolutely uphold zero COVID, and then a couple days later suddenly be like, oh yeah, we're ending it. They can't just say, oh, we're ending it, because it's like, oh, you know what? Like, you were just saying that you were maintaining it just a few days ago. But those measures were really significant because they basically announced effectively the end of scanning health codes most of the time, which was the way the government had restricted the movement of a lot of people. It was also saying things like, officials should not lock people down in their neighborhoods. You should just lock down individual houses or individual apartment units. And that was a major shift as well.
So no more using an app on your phone to get a green, yellow, or red rating that decides where you can go and where you can't.
Yeah, exactly. And also, no more checking PCR tests most of the time. That was a big one.
Yeah. I mean, in November and December, COVID numbers were already creeping up in China. So how did the zero COVID policy ending impact numbers of infections, and what happened then?
There was this period for a couple of weeks where things seemed kind of normal. And it was like, maybe everything is fine. And, there was a bit, people were going to restaurants and so excited that they could go without necessarily having to go through all these restrictions. You could travel around. And then things fell very silent in Beijing because everyone was getting sick. I mean, basically, there was a weekend when it felt like half of my office had fallen sick with COVID, and a bunch of my friends fell sick with COVID. And to give you an idea of how weird that was, I mean, before they started lifting these restrictions, I didn't know of a single person who caught COVID in China for the past 3 years.
Wow.
Because zero COVID, had been that strict and that effective. Nobody I knew was getting COVID. And then suddenly overnight, it seemed like everyone I knew was getting COVID.
Was that shift reflected in China's official COVID counts?
No, absolutely not. It wasn't reflected in the COVID count at all. And, at first, while people were trying to figure out what was going on, it wasn't really clear. But then as the days passed by and as everyone started getting infected, it became increasingly clear that the official count was not reflecting reality. It was saying things like, oh, there's thousands of cases or tens of thousands of cases. And you're like, half the city is probably infected. What are you talking about? Beijing is a city of 20 million people. If half the people in the city are getting infected, there's no way it's a couple thousand cases or tens of thousands of cases. And at a certain point, to the government's credit, they basically threw up their hands and they said, yeah, I mean, we're not counting this anymore. We're not publishing the statistic anymore because there's no way we can keep track of what's going on here.
But there have been these reports that even if your relative dies with COVID, they're probably not being counted as a COVID death because China has decided to be very strict in terms of how it interprets COVID deaths in a very different way than the U.S. or Britain or even Hong Kong tend to count up how COVID has impacted their mortality rates.
That's correct. Actually, that's been China's practice from the beginning. They've always only counted deaths from COVID if the death was caused directly by COVID. And there's also been some of the same issues we've seen elsewhere in the world where there's inconsistent standards as to how to count a COVID death, Is it a death caused by pneumonia? Can you count deaths that are caused for other reasons? At the same time, though, even considering China's stricter definition, it seems pretty clear at this point that there's, far more than the 40 or so people they've said have died from COVID since the beginning of the lifting of restrictions.
Is that literally what the number is, 40 now?
It's something in that neighborhood. And that's just... it's just absurd, right? I don't think anyone believes that number.
In the last couple of days, Chinese officials finally admitted what the Chinese public had figured out already. They disclosed that between December 8th and January 12th, 60,000 Chinese people died with COVID. Many doubt that this is a full accounting, and many think these numbers are about to get much worse.
And so the biggest worry right now is the upcoming Spring Festival in China, which is the biggest holiday. It's also the biggest annual human migration on the planet. And so a ton of people are going to be going home to the countryside to see their parents or their relatives. And they're worried that, this is going to bring COVID to a lot of the most distant corners of China.
Oof. So it sounds like you're saying the waves are going to kind of just keep coming for a while. That's the fear.
I mean, it's going to take a while for a virus, no matter how infectious, to burn its way through, a country of over 1 billion people, right? And it's just a huge country. It's a huge, diverse country. And in fact, the biggest concern is not, this COVID wave in the big cities, Shanghai or Beijing, which are the most developed cities in the country and have a pretty good medical infrastructure. The concern is what happens when COVID burns through the countryside. The medical infrastructure there is much poorer, and it's to the point where many counties don't have a single ICU bed. And so people who get sick and are critically ill in places like that have to go to the bigger cities in order to get medical care.
And will they find a bed there when they get there?
I mean, that's another question, right? I mean, when I went into the countryside to answer exactly this question, I found that a lot of hospitals were just totally overwhelmed. You would go into the ERs and it was pandemonium. I mean, you would see nurses and doctors running back and forth, wheeling ventilators. You would see relatives crowding around counters asking for medication. There were people sprawled out on the hallway, on the floors, or on metal benches, waiting for care because there was just too many people there and not enough staff, not enough resources. I met someone who was actually driving from hospital to hospital, looking for a bed for her mother-in-law, and she was just not getting any success. She was getting turned away from every hospital she was going to because she was told that it was full, and she was so frustrated that, she was tearing up as she was speaking to us. I mean, it was really a dire situation.
We'll be right back after a break. Part of what was so striking to me about your reporting from China was this bifurcation. And it was happening in a bunch of different ways. There was the bifurcation of, the fact that maybe things looked normal in the cities or normal-ish, but then if you went to the hospitals, they were overwhelmed. And it reminded me of the United States. But the difference was that when this happened in the U.S., like in 2020, where some states were opening up, some states weren't, you'd see sort of the hospitals overwhelmed, maybe the city's normal. There weren't that many ways to prevent COVID. Like there wasn't a widely available vaccine, but there are now. So are we seeing in China a ramp up of these preventative measures, things that could maybe prevent people from getting sick, prevent people from dying?
Yes, I think the authorities are fully aware of what they need to be doing, but they just haven't had very much time to prepare. So they are doing things like having a vaccination campaign, trying to get that elderly vaccination rate up, trying to expand the medical infrastructure, trying to get more ICU beds in place. But unfortunately, these are not things that you can do overnight. I mean, just to give you an example, the vaccination campaign, I went to 2 vaccination sites when zero COVID was lifted, and it was empty. There was nobody getting a vaccine. I was like, what's going on here?
Is that because there wasn't interest in it, or it hadn't been promoted, or what was it?
There was plenty of promotion. Part of the reason why I went was because I could see posters saying, go get vaccinated. But I think what was going on was not that there was an interest, but that a lot of the most vulnerable people to COVID who should be getting these shots were scared of going out and scared of getting vaccinated because they were worried that while getting vaccinated, they could catch COVID. So it would have made sense to have this vaccination campaign while zero COVID was still in place, when people could go and get vaccinated without fear of getting infected. But for some reason, that didn't really happen. Another example is, ICU capacity. ICU capacity, you can have beds. You can even have the, equipment per se. But you can't just train ICU staff overnight, right? I mean, they need training. They need, kind of specialized training in order to be able to handle these kinds of situations. And they're stretched thin as they are. So you can't be doing this overnight. It's going to take, weeks, months to put this all in place. So they're trying to, be running ahead of a tsunami, basically.
Yeah. I've also read that there's been this bifurcation of public opinion where there are active debates playing out online between people who welcome the end of zero COVID and people who are looking at what's happening in terms of people getting sick, people dying, and saying, this is why we shouldn't have done this, essentially. Even Xi Jinping in his New Year's address kind of nodded to this and said, it's only natural for different people to have different concerns or hold different views on the same issue. But that seems so anathema to the kind of Chinese mindset that we've seen over the last couple of years of everyone in lockstep and agreement about how to move forward when it comes to COVID. Does that strike you too?
Yeah, and that was very apparent already by the beginning of 2022, I would say. It was becoming increasingly clear that zero COVID was becoming this polarizing topic in a way it hadn't been before. Because again, in 2020 and 2021, zero COVID was very successful. And it seemed like China was getting the best of both worlds because people would look at other countries where not only was everyone falling sick, everyone was also staying home and life was not going as normal. And in China, there was no COVID and life was going on like normal. So people were like, wow, this is wonderful. China's doing better than the rest of the world. That changed in 2022 because the restrictions became so onerous that it really became disruptive towards people's lives. It started strangling the economy. But, people are still scared of the virus. A lot of people were still scared of the virus. So there was a group of people who were like, I'm so ready for this to be over. There was a group of people who were like, we need to maintain this. And I think you see that playing out right now where some people are still like, this is so, I'm so done with this, right? And no matter what the cost, this is inevitable. Of course, people are going to die, which is true. I mean, of course, people, when you open up, inevitably, there is going to be a wave of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths, just like in the rest of the world. It's just basic science, right? But then you also have these people who are like, this is the fault of those people who pushed for zero COVID too fast. We've done this too quickly and look at the consequences. And the thing is, they're not entirely wrong about that.
Yeah, but if lifting zero COVID was supposed to kind of quell this debate or feeling of unrest, it doesn't seem like that is what happened.
I mean, I think that just like with everything else in recent history, once this wave passes through, people will kind of settle back into their normal lives. We've seen this kind of thing before, right? I mean, go back 3 years when the whistleblower doctor Li Wenliang passed away from COVID. He was punished for speaking about, or, basically trying to spread information about the spread of this mysterious new disease, and then he was punished for it. I think there was a big wave of anger when he passed away because it kind of manifested how the government had been opaque, not transparent about this virus. But that wave passed away. I mean, it just receded into the background. And as China got the virus under control, people became very happy with the government, actually. People became proud of China's zero COVID policy. And that wave of discontent kind of melted into the past.
Until it came back.
Until it came back. And so this is what I mean when I talk about discontent in China, right? I think in the short term, people are going to be happy or people are going to be unhappy about what the government is doing. There's going to be ups and downs, pretty dramatic ones, right? Because the government is taking a lot of responsibility for everything that is going on. But the bigger picture is that it is increasingly difficult to talk about even normal topics that shouldn't necessarily be politically sensitive, but have become politically sensitive, like zero COVID or like what's going on to you personally with quarantines or with the economy. And I think that does cause a certain amount of pressure to start building in society because people will start having these problems. They're going to be unhappy about certain things and they're not going to be able to express it. If they're not able to express it, those problems can fester for a long time.
So do you expect more protests like what you saw around COVID in November? And it may not even be about COVID, but because of these bigger issues that don't seem to be going away.
I think predicting discontent or protests in China or China's future in general is a bit of a fool's errand. But I will say that I don't think the underlying discontent that led to some of what we saw is going to go away because, you can get rid of zero COVID. And that is indeed one of the major issues that is driving the protests. But it's not getting down to the very root of the problem, which is that people are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the way the country is being run.
Well, and while zero COVID was a manifestation of how the country's being run, the end of zero COVID was also a manifestation of how the government's being run. That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, you look at all of that, and it's basically because, Xi Jinping is one man. He's got 24 hours in a day, just like the rest of us. And so the challenge now is this man is deciding everything. In order to get anything done, you have to get his attention, right? And that can just be a challenge. Because until then, everything is kind of stuck in a holding pattern. You're waiting for a clear signal from the top, an order from the man himself in order to get anything done. And that's just leading to a lot of problems. I think people look at this and they're like, oh, wow, like what's going on? The policy making is so illogical. Has everyone in China become brainwashed? That is not what's going on, right? People in China are not stupid. They look at the situation and they know exactly what's going on. And many people, even in the government, are uncomfortable with what's going on or with the zero COVID policy or whatever. But they just can't say anything about it because they're waiting for a clear signal from the top because things have become so top down.
Dake, I'm super grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Dake Kang is a journalist in the Associated Press's Beijing bureau. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Carmel Delshad, and Madeline Ducharme. We are getting a ton of support right now from Anna Phillips, Jared Downing, Victoria Dominguez, and Laura Spencer. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with an assist from Susan Matthews. Thanks to Ben Richmond. He makes sure I read all the ads. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go track me down on Twitter. Say hello. I'm at Mary's Desk. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here tomorrow.